For the first 25 days of December, we're going to be doing a readathon for my newest book, Nick. We know this isn't for everyone, so if you don't want us to read you a bedtime story every night, we'll still have our regular vlogs every Tuesday.
But if you do want to come along, then come on! Alright guys, welcome back. We're reading chapter 10, Cracker Bells. Down the street the three went, again weaving in and out of the crowds that went about their day. Nick noticed that they were drawing an awful lot of attention. They were being snubbed by many, and even peered upon with horrid glances. He thought that it might have been because of their filthy clothing, or perhaps because they were without a guardian, to give the impression they were no more than unattended children left to run amok. Either way, it was starting to make them feel uncomfortable. Noticing this, Emma rounded a corner. Nick and Gilbert went following after her. They went into an alley that offered them enough privacy so that they may gather their thoughts in peace. It was this dumpster-infested alley where Emma unfolded her new map and gave it another look over. There wasn't a doubt in mind that the artist who had drawn this map was gifted. It was beautifully drawn, but it wasn't until they gave it a closer inspection that they realized how truly magical it was. The map was a chart of the entire globe, marked with countless countries along each of the 7 great continents, and the names of the nations glowed and shimmered by only the grace of Emma's gentle touch. The painted versions of themselves were gathered around a section of the map, labeled as New York City. Emma tapped their position on the map slightly. The map enlarged to show their precise location and the city around them, and every time they took a step, so did the painted replicas of themselves. "We're here," Emma spoke with muster. She swept her finger across the map, followed her finger's trail, leading to the Atlantic Ocean, where a painted humpback whale emerged from within the sea, then dove back into the watery depths, disappearing for good. Her finger continued to trace the parchment, each of the countries' name gleaming bright the further they went. Norway, Sweden, Finland, Russia, and then through the glacier-filled Arctic Ocean, ending at the North Pole where specks of painted snowflakes whirled around its name. And that's where we need to get. She put some extra thought into it. We'll have to first cross the Atlantic Ocean. She rubbed her chin, while her mind churned with ideas on how they might achieve such a treacherous task. But how exactly do we do that? "I would assume a ship," offered Gilbert. And just as he did, a steamship appeared on the map in a harbor on the edge of New York City. Written upon that ship was its name, the SS Vixen. "Right there," he jabbed the map. "There's a harbor." He lifted his gaze and directed it out of the alley and down the stretch of the street. "Over there. It's just a few blocks away." Nick wasn't too sure about all of this. Are we really going to trust a magical map to lead us to the North Pole? It seems a tad irresponsible, doesn't it? "Do you have any other ideas?" Emma asked, but Nick remained mute and without expression. "In that case, I think we should trust the map." Gilbert's spirits lifted. "Then what are we waiting for? Let's go!" He took off running with Nick and Emma racing to keep up. It wasn't a long trek to the harbor. Like Gilbert had mentioned, it was only a few blocks away, and so they reached it much sooner than even expected. They went through a narrow street amongst rows of colossal buildings currently being built, worked on by men who were in the midst of making the buildings even taller than they already were. Soon the street opened up to the ocean, and upon the ocean was a long wooden dock. The dock was lined with great big cargo ships, all rocking and crashing waves, but not staying too far, as they were all anchored in place. Most of the ships were stationed and unoccupied, but one was crowded with many sailors who were all working tiresomely away. The ship was long and jet black, with slimy algae and clinging barnacles climbing up its hull. Huge stacks blasted the clouds of steam into the murky sky above. It was also filled with large crates all stacked neatly along its upper deck. Stationed on the dock was a crane. It was currently lifting a hefty crate up onto the ship where the sailors were positioned to help guide it. The crate lowered onto the ship, and immediately the men went to strap it into place. Emma noticed the name of the ship written along its side, the SX Vixen. It was a perfect replica of the one painted on her map. "That's the ship," she determined, with a delightful thrill track in her voice. Nick still held some reservations over the map. "Honestly, Emma, we don't even know where that ship is headed." One of the men on the ship then shouted, That does it, boys. We're good to go. Next stop, Norway. Emma and Gilbert then turned to Nick, the two of them sharing a pompous grin that Nick really didn't care for. He rolled his eyes and huffed. Lucky guess, I suppose. Emma nudged him with her elbow. You really should start believing in magic. Nick half smiled in return. He didn't want to mention it, especially not to his friends, who seemed keen on to the idea of it, but he held suspicions over magical things. Mr. McTwizzle might have done all he could to show them how wonderful it was, but he saw firsthand what it was capable of. Magic killed Sister Merriweather. He couldn't understand how something that could do such a horrible thing could be as wonderful as his friends made it seem. But he bit his tongue and kept his preconception to himself so not to affect the others. Come on, this way. Emma led the way down to the dock. They crept towards the ship, crouching behind tall stacks of crates so not to bring notice to themselves by all the working men. They dodged a security guard, twirling his whistle, then went on to hop from one crate to the next until they spotted an entrance. A door on the ship had been left open. The last men bound for the ship and walked up a ramp and through it. The children knew it was their only shot, and so they took it. They scurried up the ramp and boarded the ship, right into the corridor, where the men who had just entered continued walking down. Nick took the lead, fleeing off from the opposite direction. The corridor was lined with heavy metal doors, but they came to discover that each were locked. That is, all but one. Emma opened the door and stole a peek, determining it was safe enough to go on. This one, she told the others as she stepped through the door. Nick and Gilbert went in after her. The room wasn't at all what Nick had expected in such a grand ship as the one they were in. It wasn't so much a room as it was a big closet. It was filled with cleaning supplies of many kinds, and so Nick assumed they were in a janitor's closet. Emma glanced around the closet. I guess we should get ourselves comfortable. I expect it to be an awfully long journey, as I'm sure it'll take several days before we arrive in Norway. Gilbert had already made a spot for himself on the floor. He had found a bundle of wool blankets rolled up on a shelf and drew one free and claimed it for himself. He then draped it across the floor and made himself right at home. Emma took another blanket from the shelf. Her eyes felt instantly heavy. It then struck her that she hadn't slept in over 24 hours. She took off her jacket and folded it up for a pillow. She then closed her eyes and fell fast asleep. Gilbert followed close behind. Nick, however, wasn't tired at all. He ought to have been, but he wasn't. His mind was too active, so he went around a stack of boxes and got himself comfortable on the floor with his back propped against it. He sat there while his friends slept, thinking over how much his life had changed in such a short span of time. Nick had been an orphan for as long as he could remember, but never had he felt more like one than he did at this very moment. Sister Merriweather was gone, and so were all of the family he had ever known, and he realized that he no longer had a home to return to. After all, this was finished. The home he had known, Lost Star Orphanage, was gone, destroyed, and it was all because of magic. He felt angry and sad, both emotions building in his chest until it ached. He didn't like magic. Actually, he was starting to hate it. The ship's foghorn then blared, and following horrific noises, Nick could feel a heavy rumble vibrating beneath him. Through a small, circular window, he could see the ship pulling from the dock, cutting through the waves as it began through the harbor and out into the unknown. Before he knew it, Nick had fallen asleep as well. Hours whisked by during which the sun had set, and even rose again, and yet still Nick was sound asleep. Gilbert, however, had been up for quite some time. He toyed with the cracker bells while the others slept, fascinated by how the bells glimmered from the drop of magic slumbering inside. He held a handful of the bells, and they all jingled around in his hand. He plucked one up, and then studied it carefully through his glasses. He then held it to his ear and jingled it some more, the tinkle it made sounding like sweet music, and it left a smile to slid across his face. He really wanted to know how it worked, but didn't even know how to begin to discover such secrets. He tossed it up and then caught it, but nothing extraordinary happened at all. He then rolled it across the floor, but again, nothing. He picked it back up and then gave it a closer inspection. It was during this his stomach began to growl, and it reminded him that he hadn't eaten in quite some time. His mind began to turn, and before he knew it, he was imagining his last supper at the orphanage, amongst all his family and friends. His imagination whirled, and the more it did, the more he could see Sister Meriwether's roasted turkey sizzling on the table, surrounded by bowls of red-skinned potatoes, baskets of corn, and seasoned vegetables. Even vegetables sounded appetizing to him. And that's when Gilbert knew he wasn't just hungry, but devastatingly famished. He could smell dessert, cookies of all kinds, followed by apple pie with a flaky crust that made his mouth tingle. The more he imagined, the more the Cracker Bell began to brighten in his hand, until finally he released it. Gilbert shielded his eyes from a flash of shimmering gold, and by the time he lowered his hands, all the food he had imagined appeared all around him. There was Sister Meriwether's mouth-watering turkey sizzling on a plate on the floor directly in front of him. There was a bowl of potatoes on a box nearby, a basket of warm biscuits next to that, and then a plate of corn on the cob appearing right by Emma's nestled head. Gilbert stood in awe, cookies materializing on porcelain plates, one after the next. Soon they were everywhere. Lastly, something warm and heavy arose in his hands. He looked down and there was a freshly baked apple pie. Holy cow! Gilbert dropped it to the floor and crossed his legs, then dug into the pie with nothing but his hands. He took a bite, then went on munching away. He basked in the sweetness, rushing up to the roof of his mouth. This is the best pie I've ever tasted. He took another bite, crust crumbs and apple filling left smeared across his mouth and cheeks. Emma moaned awake. She was finding it difficult to open her eyes, as she was still groggy from all of the sleep she had caught up with. Her eyes soon fully opened, and then they sparkled at all the delicious food scattered through the largest closet. She then spotted Gilbert on the floor, munching on apple pie. Where did all this food come from? Magic, Gilbert informed with a mouthful of pie. I was playing around with one of the Cracker Bells, trying to figure out how it worked, when suddenly I felt quite hungry. He scooped up another handful of pie and then bit into it. Before I knew it, the Cracker Bell went off and all this food appeared. It's my educated guess that this magic inside works by one's imagination. Emma had stopped following along somewhere during Gilbert's lengthy explanation. She dragged the plate of turkey over, then ripped off a leg and began to indulge. The turkey was succulent. The skin was crispy and slightly burnt, exactly how she liked it, and the meat was perfectly moist. She couldn't remember ever tasting turkey so delicious before. It could have been because of magic, or perhaps only because she was so very hungry, but either way, it didn't matter. She just went on to enjoy her meal. The ship then hit a huge wave, and it rocked Nick awake. He could smell the food instantly, even before he had the chance to see it all. He lifted himself up and followed his nose, coming out from behind a stack of boxes to find his friend surrounded by piles of food. Nick wasn't sure if he was still dreaming or not, so he blinked a few times before taking another glance around. Where did you get all this food from? Emma and Gilbert turned to him. Emma had a biscuit in her mouth, slathered with strawberry jam, while Gilbert gnawed on corn like a dog with a bone. Magic, they answered together. Nick was taken aback. But didn't Mr. McTwizzle say that creating food out of magic was against the rules of magic? Ignoring Nick, Gilbert grabbed the plate of apple pie and offered it to him. Would you like some? It's quite delicious. Nick could feel his mouth watering, but he refused even still. No, thank you. His stomach then grumbled, and it was loud enough for them all to hear. Of course he wanted food. He was starving. He couldn't even recall the last time he had eaten, but he didn't want any food so long as it came from magic. But that apple pie sure did look delicious, and those red-skinned potatoes seasoned with rosemary were smelling awfully good right about now. So much so that he could almost taste it. Well, he internally debated with himself. It would be a shame to let it go to waste. Nick joined them on a blanket on the floor, then helped himself to a smidge of everything. His friends were right. The food was delicious. In fact, it just might have been the most enjoyable meal he had ever had the privilege of tasting before. He was only going to have a bite, but couldn't stop himself after that. Before long, he was working on dessert, which, of course, were cookies, as those were always his favorite. Nick stuffed a warm chocolate chip cookie into his mouth, and before giving himself the chance to swallow, he crammed in several more, including one swirled with cinnamon, another filled with a gooey peanut buttery center, and lastly, a cookie topped with almond flakes. He couldn't get enough. None of them could. Emma helped herself to another turkey leg, and Gilbert began working on shoveling red-skinned potatoes into his mouth, during which Nick scrambled through the closet, collecting plates of cookies that continued to materialize out of thin air. They kept eating, but the more they ate, the less content they felt. Gilbert grew frustrated with his fork. He couldn't get enough of the potatoes in his mouth at once, so he snatched up the bowl, brought the rim to his lips, and then poured the potatoes straight into his mouth. While doing so, he caught notice of Nick scavenging through the closet, hunting for cookies with his arms stacked with a tower of empty dishes. He then spotted Emma with a pair of turkey legs gripped in her fists. She was taking turns biting into one leg and then onto the next. A golden glimmer then caught Gilbert's attention. That's when he noticed the Cracker Bell laying there on the closet floor, rattling while glowing bright from within. Every few seconds or so it would tinkle, and when it did, more food would materialize right after. Loaves of bread, baskets of fruit, cooked meats, exotic cheeses, along with loads of more cookies on porcelain dishes that Nick continued to chase after. Gilbert watched as Nick and Emma continued to overindulge, neither one of them seeming close to satisfied. This prompted him to his belly, which continued to grumble as though he hadn't eaten a thing in days. Just as the ceiling began to rain little, hard candies, Gilbert came to the realization of what was really happening. Magic. His eyes brightened. It's magic. Gilbert crawled across the floor, ducking to avoid warm biscuits cannoning over his head after appearing out of nowhere. He then stopped as a mound of pastries rose from underneath him, taking him with it as shot to the ceiling. He rolled down the pastries, then landed on the floor where he jumped to his feet and sprinted to Nick. By the time Gilbert reached him, Nick was laying on his back with his mouth raised and open to catch as many of the hard candies that were drizzling from the ceiling. "Nick!" Gilbert shook him while being battered by candy. "Snap out of it." "Not now, Gilbert. I've never been so hungry in all my life." He reached for an eclair at the side of him and then shoved it into his mouth. Gilbert honed in on Emma, watching as she wolfed down little Danish cakes drizzled with a creamy berry sauce, one after the next. "Emma," he ran after her, "you have to listen to me. It's magic. It's tricking us. It's making us feel like we're starving when we're not." He shook her. "You have to snap out of it. If not, I'm afraid we'll eat ourselves to death." "Gilbert, I'm sorry, but I can't. I'm simply starving," she cried while forcing another Danish cake into her mouth. "I'm so hungry it hurts." Gilbert spotted the Cracker Bell again, now rolling into place in the center of the closet as wisps of shimmering light began to seep out from the cracks in the golden shell. The closet was rising with more and more food at every turn. The longer Gilbert stood there picking at his brain for a clever idea on what to do, the more the Cracker Bell became more difficult to see in all of the food that was materializing around it. The food doubled, and then it tripled, and soon Nick and Emma became lost within it. Gilbert felt the weight of all of their lives heavy on his shoulders. He puffed out his chest and then pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He then charged across the room, dodging scoops of ice cream now falling from the ceiling and then exploding at his feet like ignited dynamite on a treacherous battlefield. He jumped into a glide, using a layer of chocolate syrup spilt across the floor to propel him towards the Cracker Bell. He went for it, but the golden bell scorched him like boiling water. He leaned back, using the heels of his boots to break himself from the chocolatey syrupy floor. He then threw his foot into a stomp, but the Cracker Bell remained intact. Gilbert could feel the bell vibrating violently beneath his foot, and the golden light within brightening and brightening, like it was getting ready to implode. He scanned the room and spotted a circular window overlooking the ocean, which had been left ajar. He fixed his glasses and then bit his lip. He then kicked. The Cracker Bell flew through the air and straight out of the window. Gilbert felt the warmth of relief when he heard a tiny splash shortly after. But his relief was short-lived. An explosion ignited beneath them, and the ship tipped to its side, leaving Gilbert and his friends crashing to one wall, with all the food, boxes, and shelves of cleaning supplies burying them beneath it. The ship then rocked back into place, and the three orphans came tumbling back, smacking face first onto the floor. By the time the ship steadied, and they were each able to climb back to their feet. All of the food was gone. There wasn't a single trace that any food had been there at all. Not even a crumb. Alright, hope you enjoyed that chapter. I am very hungry, again, because of all that food. But join us tomorrow for chapter 11, The Captain and His Crew.